All right, we are going to talk about what's called imaginary numbers, okay, which is the opposite of a real number, okay? And an imaginary number is just the square root of a negative number, okay? And we're going to talk about what they would mean in context of parabolas later on, but we're just going to figure out how to use them in equations and how to simplify them and all of those things. Okay, so the square root of -1 is equal to I, and it's always written as a cursive I. So when you're doing your homework and your tests, make sure it's cursive. So looking at these right here, we want to simplify them. Okay, some of them we can actually square root and get an integer. Okay, so if we're looking at this one, we've got -1, we have 11 times 11. Remember, we're looking for pairs of numbers. And anytime you see a -1, that comes out as an I. So if we take both of those out, we're left with 11I. So to make it cursive, you just make this little tail on the front end of it. Okay. Looking at this one, got -1, and then 3, 3, 3. So we take out what we can, which is a 3 and an I. So we've got 3I root 3. Okay, what about this one? -1 and then what? 2, 3, 3. Okay, so we can take an I out and we can take a 3 out. So we've got 3I here, and then root what? 2 is still left over. This one, -1, 5, 5, 5. Take out an I, take out a 5. And then this 5 is still left over. Questions on that? So not a whole lot new from what we were doing before when we were simplifying radicals, but now we're just taking that -1 out as an I in the front. Okay. All right, so if we were asked to solve this and get x by itself, what would we do?
Subtract 256.
Mm-hmm. And then what? Mm-hmm. What's that? Okay, now what? We square root both sides. Okay, what's the square root of 64? Okay, so when we take that out, what are we going to write? What about this negative right here? Okay, now anytime from here on out until the end of the year, whenever you square root in an equation to actually solve for x, we need to put a plus or minus in front. Okay, so we add plus or minus, but our answer is 8i. Okay, and the I just means that we had a negative underneath a root. Questions on that? Okay, this right here. Now, I to the first power is equal to I. Do we agree with that? Okay, if we square I, let's think about this. I is the same thing as the square root of -1. If we square both sides, what happens? Square and square root cancel out, and you just get -1. So that's where this -1 is coming from right here. Okay. The reason that this one is red is because it's the most common one that you'll see. And anytime you see I squared, you just replace it with -1 because they're the same thing. Okay. I to the third ends up being -I, and I to the fourth is +1. And then this pattern repeats over and over again. Forever. Okay, now here's how you can remember this, because we're only going to really focus on these because it repeats over and over again. So to remember what order they go in, just think of I won, okay, and then the middle two are negative. So it's always going to be, and we're going to repeat this rewrite it on the next page, but it's always I won, negatives on the middle. All right, so we're going to use that when we're simplifying this. So let's put that over here on the right. So we've got I won, negatives on the middle two. This is going to be your little cheat sheet right here. So this is equal to I to the first, I to the second, I to the third, I to the fourth. Write that at the top of your paper on your homework. Okay, so the variable, the imaginary I, is treated like any other variable, like x. Okay, so when we multiply 3i times 4i, what is that? 12i squared. Okay, now we always want to simplify whenever you have exponents on there. So I squared is the same thing as, we wrote it down here on the right. Okay, so we replace that with -1, which gives us the answer of -12, because we want it to be as simple of an answer as possible. Okay. Looking at the next one. Let's change both of these. Let's simplify both of these roots. So we've got -1, and then what's the prime factors of 20? 2, 2, 5. We're going to multiply that by -1 and 2, 2, 3. Okay, so let's take out what we can. We've got a pair of 2's here. We have an I there, I here, and a 2 there. Okay, so we've got 2i root 5 times what? 2i root 3. Okay, so when we multiply these, we multiply the things that are alike. All right, so we've got to multiply these together, and then we multiply the roots together. So if we're putting the numbers together in the front, what would that be? Remember, we're multiplying. 4i squared, and then square root of 15. We have to simplify it a little bit because we have an exponent. I squared is the same as -1, so this is really -4 root 15. All right. Now we're not going to repeat this pattern that we have down here 31 times so we can figure out where this goes. There's actually a shortcut. Okay, alongside this, we're going to put a little bit of a shortcut key. Here's what it is. If we take, hold on, let's write these down first. If we take our exponent and we divide it by 4 and look at what comes after the decimal, it's always going to line up with these numbers. So for instance, if we had I to the first power, we take 1 divided by 4, what do we get? 0.25, that's where that came from. 2 divided by 4, we get 0.5. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75. 4 divided by 4 means you're going to have an integer answer, no number after the decimal. So if we have 31 right here, tell me what 31 divided by 4 is. 7.75. Okay, so that lines up with I to the third, which means it simplifies to be negative I. Okay, so on your key, when you get your test or your homework or whatever you're working on with imaginary numbers, you put this down first, I1, I1, and then you just jot these down as a reminder of what comes after the decimal. Because if you divide this and you get 0.75 on the end, then you know you're looking at the 0.75 row. So we're going to try that over here, even though these are much smaller. So we just want to replace these all with whatever their simplified version is using that shortcut. So we're going to divide each of the exponents by 4. Okay, so we take 5 divided by 4 and we get what? 1.25, right? So we're looking at the top one. So we replace it with I. 3 divided by 4. Is 0.75. Here. Let's put jot some notes here. Okay, so that's where the 0.25 came from. That's why we picked the top row. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75, so we're going to replace it with negative I. 8 divided by 4, we get 2. So which one is that? The bottom one, because 2 is 2.0. Okay, so we're going to replace it with 1. Now we just simplify it. Okay, so we've got 4i. What does this turn into? 3i. So now we have 4i plus 3i plus 10. Now, mathematicians prefer that answers are in this form, where the term with the imaginary piece on it comes second. So how would we write this right here? 10 plus 7i. That's the most simplified version. So anytime there's exponents on your imaginary numbers, you want to get rid of them by using this key over on the right-hand side. And I highly recommend you write it on the top of your homework and immediately on your test. Help you out. We good? Okay, let's do a couple more before we get to the homework. And this is what I was just talking about. So, what are we going to do on this first one? Aren't we just combining like terms? You're subtracting the two things from each other. So we can really just rewrite this like this. 5 minus 6i minus 3 plus 8i. Okay, we're subtracting everything in here. So if you subtract a negative 8, that means you're adding 8i. Okay, so now we combine like terms and we get what? Two plus 2i. Is that what you said? Okay. What are we doing on the next one? Are we subtracting on this one? No, we're multiplying the two. So how do we typically organize those in this class? We do the window. Okay, so let's do that. So we've got 2 minus 4i, 3 plus 5i. Now we'll just figure out what the numbers are inside the squares. What's the first one going to be? We multiply, so we get 6. Mm-hmm. And this one. Yep. Okay, so let's put these two together in the middle and we get what? Negative 2i. So I've got 6 minus 2i minus 20i squared. But we can't have exponents. We need to simplify that. I squared is really negative 1, so I'm just going to replace that with a negative 1.
Would it be plus 20 then?
Yep, so now it's going to be plus 20. So what's our final answer going to be here? Perfect. 26 minus 2i. What should we do here? What's the math word I'm looking for? So we're going to distribute the negative 6i. So now we have negative 24i. And then what? Okay, and I squared is really negative 1. So what's the answer going to be? Questions? Okay, this one down here, we're going to have one just like it on the test. So fractions are finicky, and they don't like to have certain things in the bottom. Tell me something that you already know cannot be at the bottom of a fraction. Square roots and 0. Okay, imaginary numbers also don't like to be on the bottom. So what could we do to this? What could we multiply the bottom by so that it would eventually get rid of the I? Not negative 1. We could multiply it by I. If we multiply the top and the bottom by the same thing, we're not changing the fraction at all. So let's see what happens when we do this. If we multiply the top by I, what do we get? Okay, and what do we get on the bottom? We really get 5i squared, but we have I squared twice on here now, right? So we're going to replace those I squareds with what some people already can see we're going to do here. We've got 4i plus negative 1 and 5 times negative 1. So now this is really 4i minus 1 over negative 5. Now, we need it in this form, a plus bi. So how are we going to do that? Okay, so what would that look like? What would the first? Okay, you're totally right, but we're going to take it a little bit slower than that. So if we just break it up into two fractions, what would it look like? Okay, so let's talk about this. This negative 5 right here, if we break this up, negative 4i divided by negative 5 and negative 1 over negative 5, you can break those up just by putting the negative 5 under each of the two terms. Okay, this is kind of the in-between step to get to this point, which is just, hold on, that's not a negative on the top. Okay, so the first one, we just have a negative 4/5 I, and then why did this turn into plus 1/5? Yeah, the two negatives canceled out, but it's not in this form yet. So this is what Shelby was talking about. She first started saying 1/5. All you have to do is rewrite these in the other order, okay? Because we need the number that's by itself first, and then the one with the I on it. Okay, so it's just breaking that up into two separate fractions and then making sure your imaginary term comes second. Questions? This right here is going to be half of your test because our test in a few days, we have complex numbers, which is everything we learned today, and then all of our solving quadratics lessons that are going to be lumped into the other half of it. Okay, so make sure that you're asking for help today if you need it.